graced with another Gibson. This is an LG-0 from the very first year of that model's manufacture, 1958. This is a small body, ladder braced, all mahogany guitar. The most inexpensive thing in the catalog in the late 50s. It was aimed at beginners, obviously, or the budget-minded, maybe. Yeah, because at that time you could buy a Harmony H165, which is another all-mahogany guitar, very similar in most respects, for like half the price of this one. So I think they were trying to offer something to that segment of the market, and it went on to be pretty popular. They shipped about 2,400 of these in its first year. By the mid-60s, they were selling 8,000 or 9,000. And it lasted until the early 70s, at which point I think Gibson decided pushing inexpensive Epiphone models made more sense, and just sort of keep their name for their classier instruments, you know. These are a love 'em or hate 'em guitar. The mahogany has a distinct tonal character, as does the ladder bracing. You put them together, and it tends to be kind of dry and dusty sounding. To me, they sound like the way a dry white wine tastes that's been corked, you know? Good for certain kinds of music, maybe not as refined. Today they're thought of as blues guitars. I think in the 50s they were probably marketed towards college students who wanted to play folk music more than anything. There are shops that take these apart and rebrace them with an X-brace pattern, which can make sense if that's what you want. I mean, as long as it's done well, I don't have a problem with that, because there are a lot of them. They're not too pricey, not too precious. Checking out the condition of this one, there are some good points and some not so good. The most obvious issue is the bridge is loose and hanging by a thread. Well, it's actually hanging by the two screws securing it through the soundboard, but that needs to get glued on. The frets are very low, and there's some deep pitting in the first position here. The soundboard has a couple of crush injuries here, a couple of cracks near the waist. The thing with these mahogany guitars is, because it's a hardwood, in order to make it flexible enough to do the job, it has to be really thin. And the top on this is just under 100 thousandths of an inch thick, which is 2.5 millimeters, which is maybe 20% thinner than a comparable top made of spruce. So if you're one of those people who like to grab a guitar, you know, around the waist like this with a powerful claw, there's just not enough support, and it'll crunch. I can feel there's a loose brace in that area. So I'm going to do the thing where I add 2 sound hole support braces on either side of the hole, which will keep this area more stable, and I'll put some cleats in as well. I can't tell for sure without strings on it, but I think this neck is in pretty good shape. It's got some forward bow, and hopefully the truss rod will help us out there, but projecting a line from the top of the frets to the bridge seems to suggest that this isn't going to need a neck reset. Because even with the bridge being loose, it projects to a point above the front edge of the bridge. Happy days. The saddle seems like it might be untouched from the day it was made, and it will likely need a bit of lowering. And again, I can't tell for sure until we actually get the strings on, but the geometry seems excellent, especially if we add in the fact that we're going to do a refret on this thing and put on some taller frets, so I might not have to mess with the neck angle. This thing is loose enough that I can unscrew the nuts by hand. The whole thing will probably just come right off. Alright. Can't forget about the tiny little washers that sometimes get lost. This is another one of those guitars with the silly spruce bridge pad. It's maybe 2 inches wide, runs between 2 of the ladder braces, most of the way across the soundboard. Being a softwood, it just has no resistance to the ball ends of the strings. It gets chewed up almost immediately, and the ball ends end up resting against the underside of the top, which can cause a couple of issues. Most pressingly is oftentimes the wound portion at the end of the string will rise up and over top of the saddle. So we are going to want to put a bridge pad overlay in this one. In order to fit this precisely to the top, I'm going to have to remove the screws here. So I will heat up the dots with a little steam and pull those out of there. While my iron is heating up, we'll get in really close and take a look at the interesting pattern of vintage micarta. This is a laminate material made up with resin and fabric, almost like canvas, pressed together under heat and pressure. And it makes a reasonably good saddle material. Took me a second to figure this out. Under the pearl dot, the cavity has been filled with some translucent, white, flaky stuff that might initially be mistaken for something like asbestos or maybe mica, but which is actually melted lacquer stick that's been dribbled in there to take up the space. Some white stuff in there, which is probably carcinogenic. Sometimes these old saddles can be really difficult to remove intact. On occasion they've actually been glued in place, and other times it's just a combination of things like lacquer, general shrinking of the wood around them. You don't want to force it too hard. You could end up splitting the wood or breaking the saddle. You might put a drop of naphtha in there to try and lubricate things. There we go. Yeah, I think this was adhered with something. You can see the embossed pattern of the bottom of the saddle here. Either the striations left from a circular saw, or maybe even the woven pattern of the micarta. I'll have to clean that out as best as possible. I'll get rid of remnants from the soundboard and then scrape the surface pretty close to flat and clean. On the surface of the soundboard under the bridge, you can see that there have been some fairly heavy-duty lines incised into the mahogany here. This is a holdover from older European woodworking traditions where, when using hide glue, they wanted to make sure that surfaces were kind of rough. I think it's more to do with positioning and holding things. You know, a place for the glue to gel while it actually sets, rather than increasing the holding power of the glue. I think there have been studies that were done that showed that a smooth surface was actually better in terms of adhesion, but you will often find these things in older guitars. Sometimes the surface of the bridge has been scraped up with a special tool or just the edge of a back saw or something like that. Striations. The lacquer finish on this guitar is extremely thin. It's sort of an open poured finish. It's probably one shot of sealer and then 2 coats of lacquer. They weren't going for high gloss. You guys getting tired of seeing me do this yet? This is probably the best example so far. There's the high spot. Get rid of it with a scraper. It just cuts down on the amount of time I'll spend sanding, which is still going to be considerable. I need to remove the pick guard so I have a nice flat surface to clamp the bracing to.
you can really see the color difference from fading. These are ready to glue in. They're about 3.5 millimeters thick, 140 thousandths. They will significantly stiffen this area. Gotta clean those surfaces. Here's the bridge pad overlay. It's about a 1/16 of an inch thick, hard maple, 1.5 millimeters. And I've mentioned in the past, I like to make it wide enough that in the future, if someone wants to install a K&K style pickup with the transducer dots, there's enough room to accommodate that, so they're not hanging over the front edge of the pad. It's depressing how often factories don't back up this bridge pin drilling operation. Brand new guitars often have massive chunks missing from the bridge pad where the drill bursts through, so use a block of wood, not your fingertips. Here I'm putting a bunch of glue into the cracks, pumping it in with a suction cup, and I'll clamp it to this flat, thick piece of acrylic. Here I'm gluing the loose end of one of the braces in this area. Here I'll be using some powerful magnets to hold a cleat where I want it to be. The cleat's attached to the magnet with some double stick tape. I put some glue on it, position it, and it will clamp up together nicely. Before reinstalling the bridge screws, I'm just going to use some paste wax on the head here to act as a resist against any glue that might infiltrate down that far. Just make it easy for the next person, who you never know, could be me. The recesses for the screws are actually quite a bit deeper than ones I've encountered from the 1960s. These seem to be just about 1/8 of an inch deep, 125 thousandths, just over 3 millimeters. And my guess is the pearl dots are probably less than half of that, likely 50 thousandths-ish, 50 or 60, yeah, 60 thousandths. So I need something about a 1/16 of an inch thick to take up some room in there. This is a 1/4 inch plug cutter, and this is a piece of Holly veneer, thick stuff that is 1/16 of an inch. Just using a little bit of Tite Bond here because it releases easily with steam and heat. After all of that patching and reinforcement and gluing, I can finally put strings on it and see what this thing looks like when it's strung to pitch. Okay, this is very fortuitous. Looking good. So we got about 9/64 on the bass side, which is like 3.5 millimeters, and 7 on the treble, which would be about 2.8. If we account for the taller fret wire I'm going to use, the action will come down another 1/64 or thereabouts. So 8 on the bass, 6 on the treble. And looking at the saddle, there is plenty of room for adjustment. The neck on this thing, if we're honest, was overset at the factory. It was pitched back a bit too much. Doesn't happen all that often. Sometimes it's very destructive when it does happen. But they got away with it this time, much to our benefit. Because there is basically a full 1/4 of an inch of saddle exposed above the top of the bridge. So we could lop off a 1/16 and it would just be sort of like factory standard. The neck relief at the 6th fret here is 10 thousandths, which isn't bad. We might be able to improve it a little bit. This is another instance where we've still got black paint on the truss rod. So I'm going to loosen it to start with. Seems okay. It's funny. I was thinking to myself just the other day that it's weird. So far this year, I think I've only done 6 refrets. Just one a month which is, it's a slow pace for me. Heating the fret up makes it easier to remove. Resinous woods like this rosewood, sometimes that resin can leach out and sort of stick to the edges of the fret tang, effectively gluing it in place. Or sometimes actual glue has been used, and this will soften any glue. Here I'm cleaning out the fret slots with a homemade pick that's made from a feeler gauge of the correct thickness for the slot. This gets rid of any debris, filler from the ends of the frets and that kind of thing. I'll put a radius on the fret wire using a fret bender. I like it to be just a little bit tighter than the radius that's on the board. This makes sure that the ends of the frets stay seated over time. And I have to clean the gunk off them. There is a grease on them from machining. I'll cut them all to length. And even though this isn't a bound board, I'm going to nip off the ends of the fret tangs as if it was. This prevents them from poking out at a later date, especially if they dry out. It's June when I'm doing this, so things are pretty humid. And come January, if I don't do that, oftentimes the ends of the frets will stick out past the end of the board, and I'll have to redress them. I use a little bit of fish glue in the slot, and I hammer to get them positioned and press them into place with these jaws. It's sort of a hybrid system between traditional and modern fretting. And I clean off any excess glue. When that's had a few hours to dry, I can nip off the ends. On older guitars like this, if the last 3 or 4 frets are in good shape and still close to full height, I'll label them and save them in case I need to do a partial refret in the future in, say, like the first position on a different guitar of similar vintage. The new frets are much too tall for this nut, which is a bit worn and not so great, so I have to make a new one. I'm dressing the ends of the frets close to flush with the sides of the fingerboard using a mill file. This is delicate work. Over the body I use a piece of scraper stock to protect the top. Then I can use my angled file holder to dress and make things more uniform. Those are blobs of dried glue on the paper I'm using to collect the swarth. It's not purulent discharge. Before dressing the frets, I want to get the surface of the fingerboard as flat as I possibly can. This means the fret tops in the board will be parallel with each other when it's at rest, and they should pull up together in tandem into a pleasing kind of relief when the string tension hits it. So I adjust the truss rod until that's what I see. I don't always use the neck jig to simulate string tension. If the neck is stiff and it's obedient, and I've done a good job with my fretting, a few passes with the sanding beam is all that's necessary. Then there's recrowning. Not much to do in this case, after which I'll be polishing. You know the drill. People ask why I do that by hand and not with a buffing wheel. Something about the ergonomics doesn't work for me at this stage in my life. It hurts my wrist. And the time savings doesn't seem to be that great for me. Plus, I usually have to work through at least 2 grits to get through the filing marks on the top of the fret anyhow. So, I don't know. It can be done, and it does a nice job. But it's about the same level of polish as I get with my usual routine. I need to round over the corners of the fret ends, so with the safe edge file I'll get right down in there, after which I'll turn it over, and with this funny little compound motion I'll soften the sides into a light sort of radius. I mix up some glue and dust to fill the tiny gaps at the ends of the fret slots. I actually ended up putting a light coat of shellac on the edge of this board, as the lacquer was worn and pitted. Back to the nut, I make a nut blank, transfer the height of the fret, saw down close to the line, dress off the excess material, mark the fret placement using a pencil and then a scalpel then a fine razor saw, and finally the fret files. This is sort of a gross measurement. It'll have to be refined once it's on the guitar, but I came pretty close. You can see that there's still a bit to go for this low E string. Just a little bit of filing. With string tension on, I find that the neck has pulled up into 7/1000ths relief at the 6th fret, which is fine with me. I'll take the nut off and refine the shape, getting rid of excess height, and then gently rounding over the back edge and the sides of the nut. One interesting thing about this old micarta is when you sand it, it smells like slightly rotten salmon. I strung it up, and the action is really close, just needs a little bit more of an adjustment on the bass side, but I did hear kind of a fuzzy sort of thing going on as well in the sound, and I look inside, investigate, and it looks like the topmost back brace is loose on one side. I've been playing around with one of the StewMac glue wedges lately. It's a pretty cool design, although sometimes it's not quite thin enough to get in there, especially if both ends of the braces are still glued down, and I'll have to get in and use a dirty old piece of spring steel instead. For clamping on this one, I went old school with a couple of spruce props. Alright. The new frets are nice and tall and smooth. Action's great. Still have a lot of saddle. This thing's bulletproof. Fixed up the cracks. The top is much closer to level now. Yeah, and it's mahogany. I really like the sound of an all mahogany guitar.